welcome in to another episode of the Barnes on Bama podcast. I'm your host, Owen Barnes, and we have a ton to discuss. This episode's all going to be about basketball. We just got another commitment for the 2025-2026 roster, as well as another commitment, which I did not talk about in the previous episode when we talked about the transfer portal. So I have two more transfer portal guys that I'm going to talk about. Then I'm going to kind of open up the discussion and talk a little bit about what my thoughts are about next season's team. I still think we have a few holes in the roster. Obviously, I think that the team and the coaching staff has done a really good job thus far constructing a roster that I think is going to be a little bit better from a defensive perspective, and I think the ceiling of the offense is also even a little better, but I think that there's still a couple of pieces missing. So I'm going to talk about that. I'll open that up to questions, and then we'll get out of here. As always, if you enjoy the show, please like, subscribe, comment. It really does help me out. As always, I'm a part of the Believe Podcast Networks. If you have heard any ads on this, thank you so much for supporting the sponsors. They do help out the show. I really appreciate it. So let's get right into the topics. First things first, as I record this on Wednesday, April the 30th, Alabama just got a commitment this morning by Katon Bristow from Tarleton State. So Katon Bristow commits this morning from Tarleton State. He's the WAC Player of the Year, Freshman Player of the Year, 6'8", 190. People have had him listed somewhere between 6'7" and 6'10". I'm going to say somewhere in that 6'7", 6'8" range because obviously a lot of basketball players and sites like to overinflate the heights of these guys. But a guy that's really, really long, right? When I was actually looking up the different photos for the thumbnail for this, it was super difficult to find some where his arms are just not, taking up a huge percentage of the picture, right? He's a really long, lanky guy, somebody that I think that in a professional, or Power 5 weight room like Alabama has, nothing against Tarleton State, but I think with the strength and conditioning and the, nutrition and everything that Alabama has at its disposal, I think that we can add some weight to him and his body and frame can hold some extra weight. I think that will help him. I think where Alabama's going to want to play him is that 4 role, maybe a larger 3 in certain schemes. I don't think he's quite big enough to play a small ball 5. On the current roster, I think if you're going to play a small ball 5, I think that's going to be Taylor Bowen. I think he would be your small ball 5. But, in theory, you could have Bristow play it. I just don't think in the SEC with the athletes that we have and the physicality that we have, I don't think that he's going to be quite big enough to play that. So I would look at him more as a 3-4 role, obviously to fill some of that spot that we had from Jaron Stevenson leaving the roster, as well as a guy like Darion Reed leaving the roster. I think he more slots into that role. And what it gives us is it gives us another guy who's played some college basketball. Because one thing this roster does not have when you talk about the depth is a ton of guys outside of the starters that have played a lot of college basketball, especially at that wing spot, right? Currently, the wings who you have on the roster is Davion Hannah, Amari Allen, London Jemison. You've got these guys that are going to play well, and I feel very confident in their abilities. However, they're freshmen, right? In SEC and in high major college basketball, I don't think they're relying on a freshman to be your main wing and main distributor in that sense is what you want to do. Do I think that they could have successful seasons and can be really good? Of course, right? Obviously everybody's going to point back to your Brandon Millers of the world and, Cooper Flagg did it this past year, but those are kind of once in a generational type talents. I don't know that, obviously every team in college basketball would love to see that out of a freshman. I just don't know that's fully realistic to expect out of a freshman, right? So the more realistic thought of a freshman is that they're going to have their ups, they're going to have their downs, but it is somebody that, when they're going through that down slump, you don't need to have them be the only guy that you're relying on throughout the course of the season, right? So that's something that Bristow's at least going to give you. He's going to give you some extra depth from that standpoint. I think from a defensive standpoint, I think he has a lot of potential. A lot of the highlights that are floating around with him, there's a couple of blocks that he had on Keyshawn Hall against UCF. This is now going to be playing at Auburn, actually. His block rate was over 4.5%, which is really good at that size. Top 10 in the WAC. He's a good free throw shooter, 80%. Obviously, love to see that. From inside the arc, he's also a very good finisher. A ton of the photos and videos that I saw around him when I was kind of doing some research on this, he finishes strong around the rim, goes up strong, finishes with a lot of dunks. That's obviously really good to see. He shot 32% from three on 55 attempts. I think that number is going to go up. Obviously, in our system, you see a lot of guys that do well off catch and shoot. Their numbers go up a little more, especially because of just the way that Alabama gets you shots in our offense. You're not having to get that shot off of your own creation, as well as the emphasis being on the three and being able to space out the basketball. So I would expect that number to potentially go up a little bit, but 33% is a completely reasonable starting position for a guy of his size and a guy of his stature. So I'm not upset with what I'm seeing out of him. Obviously, this is much more of a depth and rotational piece. I would not expect him to be in the starting roster. Nothing against Bristow. I do think he's a good player, but I do not expect him to be in the starting roster, honestly, at really any point this season. If he is in the starting roster at some point this season, either something has gone incredibly well with him or something has gone horribly wrong with the roster, right? Either he's an all-world talent and, it's just over-exceeding our expectations, or we've had some major issues with the roster and he's having to start because we've had injury issues or something of that sort. So, like I said, as of this moment today, as I record this at the end of April, I would not expect him to be your starting wing or starting four-man. Obviously, I think Taylor Bowen is your starting four-man. As of this moment, your starting wing looks like it's going to be Jalil Bethea. I don't know that that's going to be your starting wing. I think that Alabama's going to go after someone else. I don't know who that name is. We'll talk a little bit more about that later on in the show. But I'm personally of the mindset that it's going to be someone else. Obviously, Rylan Griffin's the name that a lot of people have floated out. That one's still very up in the air. I've heard good things and bad things on whether that one's going to go in Alabama's favor or if he's going to go to somewhere like Texas A&M. I think that there's a lot of things behind the scenes that are going on that may or may not cause that one to happen, right? We will see how it ends up shaking out, but as of today and as of this moment, not completely sure if that's going to be the case. I know I recorded last episode and said, hey, it looked like it was going to be the case. This situation with Ryland is super fluid, so like I said, I still would give it reasonable odds that he's back. I know that Ryland really wants to be back. There are some stipulations that I think the staff's trying to put on him, and I know both sides are kind of negotiating back and forth, and I'm just not sure how that one's going to fully end out. As of this moment, I would give it a coin flip as to if he's going to be back. We will see on that one. I have heard things on both sides of that coin, right? So, like I said, I do think Bristow is going to be a very good guy for us. I would expect him to contribute next season. I think that if he can come in and play a role, like I said, like we saw out of Jaron Stevenson, obviously if he gives us that level, I think that he's overexceeded what our expectations are going to need to be for him this season. I think that he is going to be much more of a depth piece, but also a piece that is a developmental piece, right? A guy that I would expect to contribute decently well this season and have more contributing role than somebody that is a freshman would, but potentially be able to be a multi-year guy. And obviously in the transfer portal season class, and that's something that's hard to say, but when you look at the guys who are really leaving Alabama, it's guys that are looking for a different role than what Alabama has to offer them. Versus when you're looking at a transfer portal guy, in often case, Alabama is pitching them exactly the style and the position they're going to have on that team, right? So he's going to have the position on the team that Alabama has told him, like, hey, this is what we're bringing you in to do, and this is how we want to develop you. And as long as he enjoys and that's goes how he wants it to go, then in theory he could be back for the next season. And then when you have guys like that and you have guys that are multi-year guys in the system, think of like a Latrell Wrightsell. Obviously the next year it just gets better and better. Obviously we even saw jumps out of Jaron Stevenson and such in his next year in the system, out of Mo Diabate in his next year in the system, right? Both of those guys have left due to, different reasons, but, that's what you kind of want to see in today's transfer portal class. I would love to see a guy like Bristow obviously come on strong, do well for us this next season, but then obviously be a successful player for us for the next couple of years, because he is a guy that has the frame and that has the shooting and, talent ability to be able to be a guy who could get drafted in a few years, right? With the development and with the shooting and what Alabama's going to be able to do for him, I think that he definitely would have that ability to get to the NBA, right? That's what a lot of these guys want to do. So those are kind of my thoughts around Keitenn Bristow. Like I said, I think a really good pickup. I'm excited to see how he's going to be in an Alabama roster. Obviously, it's going to be a step up in competition from the WAC, but I'm excited to see how he works out for Alabama. The other guy that we committed, and he was actually our first commitment, so sorry I'm just now getting to this one. Obviously, I went through Taylor Bowen and Bethea earlier just because I felt like those were a little bit more high-profile commitments. But another guy that Alabama just had committed this last season, or for this next season, is Noah Williamson, center out of Bucknell. So Noah Williamson is a 7-foot guy. He was listed at 250 pounds last year from Latvia. A really, really good center, really skilled. When you look at his KenPom page and how some of the stats break out, 60% from 2, 32% from 3, just 60% from the line. You'd like to see that bump up a little bit, especially from a center that's going to get fouled a lot. When you talk about his foul rates, he got fouled 11th most in the entire country this last season, drawing over 7 fouls a game. Top 40 free throw rate, a guy that got to the line at just absolute ton. Really, really good rebounder, right? His defensive rebound rate was 36th in the country. Not the best from an offensive rebound perspective, but, we have Aiden Sherrill that's obviously a beast on that side of the glass. I think that he has that ability to be a better offensive rebounder, and I think that it just may also be what he was asked to do. I think he's a really good piece for Alabama. We're talking about block rates. He has a 4.5 block rate. So again, around that number that Keitenn Bristow is. So you're really looking for defensive pieces that have the ability to, block shots, alter shots, finish around the rim, be successful from 2, stretch the floor from 3. Obviously, one of the things that jumps out at you when you're talking about Noah Williamson is one of his comps is Grant Nelson from 2023, right? So when KenPom does their player comps, Grant Nelson from 2023 is one of the player comps for Noah Williamson, right? So that first year of Grant Nelson under Alabama, that is kind of what Noah Williamson has done from a statistical standpoint and from a size standpoint of how they think their games match up. So that is, from an analytics perspective, how some, people are going to be able to look at how Noah Williamson is able to do. He was an early commitment for Alabama. I think that Alabama got on him really early. I think that what he gives us is he gives us a good backup center, right? I think he gives us another guy that is going to be able to rebound, is going to be able to stretch the floor, right? I don't know that he's going to be quite as good a shooter as Aiden Sherrill. I think Aiden Sherrill is a better shooter, but I think that Williamson will continue to get better and better shooting from 3. He shot 33% the year before last, and then down to 32% this past year. In conference play, however, he shot 44%, which was 7th in the Patriot League. So he definitely has that ability to be a better shooter. It actually looks like he started 8 for 33 and then finished 20 for 45. Right, so honestly, similar to Jaron Stevenson, he kind of had an ugly start to the season shooting from 3, but then had a really, really good conference play shooting from 3 that helped get his numbers back to where they were. Like I said, 44% shooting from 3 in conference play is really, really good. Obviously, the Patriot League is not what you're going to see out of the SEC, so that is going to change a little bit. But I think that he's another really, really good piece. And again, when you're talking about this, you're talking about depth, you're talking about length, right? Something Alabama has prioritized in the portal this year has been length, right? When you look at the 4 guys that Alabama has committed thus far, you have Noah Williamson at 7 foot, you have Taylor Bowen at 6'10", you have Jalil Bethea at 6'5", at the guard wing spot, and then you have Keitenn Bristow at 6'8", right? So you have much longer, lankier guards and front court guys that are going to be able to help defend, right? That's something that Alabama had a major problem with this year. Alabama definitely had a problem against Duke in that, where they had much longer guards, much longer wings, that really caused us some issues when you had guys like, when you had multiple Mark Sears and Aiden Holloways on the floor. That Chris Youngblood, right? When those are your starting three, Chris Youngblood really liked him from a piece, but at 6'4", if he's your third man, you were just giving up so much size to a team like Duke, right? And it's something that really showed from a defensive perspective. I think from an offensive perspective, at times Alabama was okay outside of that Duke game where, you just got stifled on defense or on offense. But I thought that in general, for the most part of the season, Alabama did okay handling the larger guards and the larger wings. But I think where it really hurt us is from a defensive perspective, we couldn't switch quite as much because we weren't as long. We also had some problems from a defensive, if you're out of position because you don't have that length and that quickness to be able to get back. It was something that really hurt you, right? I don't think you had the defensive versatility this last season that Nate needs out of his team. When you looked at some of his better teams from a defensive perspective, you had a guy like Brandon Miller, at the 3, where it's a really lanky, really big guy that's able to switch a lot. That's a much bigger guy at the 3. You had a guy like Herb Jones, right? Another guy that's able to, switch everything, guard 1 through 5. It just gives you more versatility. Obviously, you don't have that guy on this roster, but when you have bigger guards and bigger guys overall, right, the overall defensive floor of the team raises. And I think that's what the goal has been this offseason, right? When you look at everything you're seeing, obviously shooting is a goal, right? Everybody knows Alabama likes to shoot the 3. I think that what you're going to see this season is there's currently not a guy on the roster that shoots poorly from 3, right? There's just not any of them. And that's something that's going to be new, right? With Noah Williamson and Aiden Sherrill both being good 3-point shooters, this is a situation where Alabama is going to have that floor spaced as well as possible the entire season instead of just having, when you have a lineup of, Mo D and Charles Betty, or not Charles, Cliff Amore out there, teams were able to sag in a little bit more, and it did clog up some of the lanes, right? So I think you really are going to have some better shooting out there when you have the 4s and 5s that you've recruited this season. So I think that that's obviously a huge plus. And then I think you're also going to have the defensive versatility and the defensive switchability that it comes with having just bigger guys, right? So I'm really happy with what I see about that. I'm really happy with how Alabama and Nate Oats and Preston Murphy have really constructed this roster. Overall, I do think that it's a roster that's going to be able to have success from that standpoint. I do not think that this roster is complete. Honestly, if this roster was complete at this moment, I would be a little concerned. We'll talk about that here in just a second, but I do think that there's a few spots of this roster that as of this very moment, again, today on April 30th, I think that we have a couple of holes in our roster that definitely scare me. So we'll talk about those now. So those holes in the roster that I was referring to, I think that Alabama has a couple of things they need to do if they're going to continue to build a successful roster for next season, right? As of today, we have 11 guys on the roster. I think that a few of the starting spots are definitely solidified. Obviously, Aiden Sherrill is going to be a starter. I think Taylor Bowen's a starter. I think Jalil Bethea is a starter. I think those are the only 3 that I can guarantee will be starters for next season. There is a world in which I could see Aiden Holloway be a starter. There's a world in which I could see him coming off the bench again. As of this very moment, I would assume he does start. But like I said, there is a world in which you pick up a wing and a guard and, just so happens that it works out that Aiden comes off the bench again. Like I said, as of this moment, I would expect Aiden to start. That may change. We'll do what I think the roster is going to look like once the roster is officially set. I'll kind of do projected starters later in the summer. But as of this moment, I think that's what I'm looking at. So what that really tells you is we're missing potentially a guard and we're missing a wing, right? When you're looking at the guard standpoint, the LP, umbrella kind of hangs over, right? There's a lot of reports that LP potentially is considering coming back. There's also some reports of, hey, he's 100% in the draft. From what we're hearing, sometimes it's, hey, LP doesn't really know if he wants to come back to school. So, sometimes we've heard, if he's not going to be a top 20 pick, then he's going to come back. But then, LP kind of thinks about, do I really want to come back to school if I'm only going to be a 29th pick, right? Maybe not, right? That's still a first rounder, all right? So I think that we're not going to know the answer to that question for a little bit, and I think that the staff knows that they're not going to know that question, and so they're looking at potentially other options, right? I think dissimilarly from what you saw out of Charles Bediako a few years ago, when we had the assumption that Chuck was coming back. The whole time he was in the portal, it was in the draft, the expectation was Charles Bediako was coming back. We built the roster with the expectation Chuck is back. Honestly, it's the reason why Alabama scheduled Purdue against Zach Edey, because it was going to be in Canada and you were going to be able to pay Chuck some of the revenue from that game in his home country, and with the way NIL worked out at that specific moment for foreign players, he was going to be able to get paid, right? That's the whole reason you scheduled Zach Edey and Purdue in Canada, was to help out Chuck. However, Chuck stays in the draft, and it really hurts the team, right? So I think that burned the Nate Oats, and I think that burned the staff from understanding, hey, if a guy is in the draft, we cannot make any assumptions, right? We have to operate under the assumption that he is gone. And if he comes back, that's great, but we have to assume he is gone, right? I think that's why Alabama went after a guy like Cedric Coward. Obviously, Cedric Coward wanted to go to Duke, and you can't blame the guy. The brand of Duke and how well they have done overall, can't blame him. Obviously, props to him. Happy for his decision. We will see how he plays this season, but that's why Alabama goes after a guy like that. I think there's still some other guys out there potentially that Alabama could go after. They are keeping all of those names very hush-hush. Even with Cedric Coward, we did not hear, and those of us that even pay a lot of attention to this and, are in group chats or in Discords or whatever, we did not hear the name Cedric Coward until Alabama was on the top 5 list, right? And I think that's very intentional, right? Nate Oats and staff have had some issues in the past where when teams hear that Alabama is on a guy, potentially other teams, I think other teams know how Alabama does from an analytics perspective and can see the potential of a player. And so I think Alabama basketball being on a player is potentially an early indicator of like, hey, this guy's really good. So when they see Alabama's name on a list, that potentially drums up some additional interest. I think that also is being used by some agents. They're throwing Alabama's name on a list to potentially drum up some interest for some guys that Alabama may not actually be interested in, right? I think some of these that you hear Alabama's, contacted, I don't know if we really did. I think some of that may just be, hey, I want Alabama to be on that list because Alabama's doing so well from a basketball perspective, right? I think there is some of that absolutely happening right now. So the question becomes, where does Alabama turn for 2025, 2026, right? And I think that there's a couple of different options. Option one is the option that I disagree with, right? And I think that it could work out, but it's one that I do not expect to take place because I think that Preston Murphy and Nate Oats are not foolish enough for this to be the case. And option number one is that they say, hey, the roster is set. If LP comes back, that's awesome. If we work things out with Ryland, that's cool. But as of now, the roster is set, and we're placing our expectation that Aiden Holloway is going to have a huge step up in a increased role. That Jalil Bethea, the reason he had problems last season was because he was at Miami, he lost his coach, and he's going to take, again, another huge step up. Latrell Wrightsell is going to be fine after the Achilles injury. He's going to be great. Taylor Bowman's going to be really good. And then Aiden Sherrill, again, in an increased role in his second season, is going to be incredible. I think that is one option. I completely disagree that Nate Oats and Preston Murphy are going to do it, right? I think that would be very foolish because I think that's kind of punting on next season and saying, well, we hope that these guys are really good. That's the least likely expectation in my opinion because from everything that I have heard, we have NIL available still. Obviously we had the NIL that potentially would be for LeVar and Fallon. We have the NIL available that would have been for Cedric Coward. We have NIL available, so I disagree that that's going to be the case. So the question then becomes, if that's not going to be what happens, what are they going to do and who are they going to pick up? And I think this is one of two things. Option one is going to be that they take some guys from the portal, right? They take guys from the portal. They're on guys in the portal today. They're on guys in the in the NBA draft today. And those guys that they're on in the NBA draft and in the portal, they don't want anyone to know that that's who they're interested in. And they don't want anybody to know, hey, that's who Alabama's coming after. Because they know if people find out that Alabama's talking to these guys, that means one of two things. That means, A, the price of those guys is going to go up. And it also means people will understand, hey, maybe these guys aren't as set on, returning to their original team, or aren't as set as staying on the NBA draft as they may be leading on. So if they find out that Alabama is talking to these guys, it could increase the price of some of these players that Alabama may potentially be on. So that could be a huge reason why you're not hearing any information about Alabama's potential targets in the portal or in the NBA draft today, right? Very logical possibility. That is a real thing. The other possibility, and this is something that we kind of talked about in the Discord, and I think is another possibility, is that Alabama is targeting a potential reclass candidate from 2026. If you've looked on Twitter over the past few days, Alabama has actually visited 5 different guards, right? You've got Jackson Richardson, there's Caleb Holt, and others, right? And because Alabama has visited these guys, it's a situation where Alabama obviously, is getting early on their recruiting trail. That's great to hear, great to see. I'm trying to see if you could potentially get in early with some of these guys. Maybe you got in late with some of the previous year's recruits, and that's why you weren't able to land a guy like Boogie Fland or some of the others which Alabama has tried to land, right? So maybe that's a possibility. Or maybe it's a possibility of you're going after a potential reclass, because that's what you want to get from a guard perspective, and you have another idea of what you want to go from the wing standpoint, whether it be Ryland or someone else, right? That's another real possibility, is that Alabama is going to go after a guard, because if you look at the way that college basketball works today, a guard as a freshman is a much better idea than a wing or a front court guy as a freshman. Guards can contribute as freshmen much more, right? So since that's the case, it would not shock me if that is the case, right? They could just be going after guys and, getting in early on the recruiting trail. It just seems a little odd that Alabama has started recruiting the 2026 guys while the transfer portal is still open and while everything is going. That's not something we've seen over the last couple of years. Obviously, they may just be changing up their recruiting strategy slightly and getting out early on those guys. That may be a possibility, right? There may not be a reclass. This is purely speculation, purely some stuff we had talked about in the Discord that I just want to kind of bring to you guys and let y'all know about. This is one of the things that I think is definitely a possibility. Would be very curious to see if that happens. Obviously, I don't think that Preston Murphy and Nate Oats are punting on next season. They're too competitive of guys. These are guys that definitely care about the roster, care about winning too much. This is not something that they're going to take very lightly. So I'm sure they have a plan. I'm just curious what that plan is. But I do think over the next month or so, we're going to find out what that plan is. And of course, I will be here to cover it. So I will have episodes coming out every 2 weeks or twice a week if possible. That is my plan throughout the summer, is to have 2 episodes a week. Additionally, as the transfer portal and everything wraps up for basketball, I will also get into some football content before fall football practice and before the fall rolls around. I will additionally have some other information once we have the roster fully set from basketball as to who I think my official starting 5 is, what I think some of the rotation looks like, any potential 2026 recruits that are visiting. I will, of course, cover it all as much as I can. If there's anything that anybody wants me to cover, throw it down in the comments. I read all of them. I comment on as many of them as I can. I really do appreciate the support. If you don't follow me on Apple or on Spotify, if you would throw me a follow over there, download the podcast. It really does help me out. My partnership with Believe is a lot of it focused on the audio side of things. So anything that you do over there really does help me out, and I really appreciate it. Thank you so much, everyone, for watching and for the support, and I will catch you in the next episode. Peace.